Have you ever found yourself wondering if, in the complex world of leadership, doing what it takes, even if it means navigating some pretty morally ambiguous territory, is sometimes not just necessary, but, well, essential for survival?
Hmm.
Or maybe you observe certain leaders who just seem to possess this uncanny ability to thrive amidst the most profound chaos, making decisions that might strike us as, frankly, shocking, yet they ultimately deliver concrete results.
Yeah, that kind of ruthless pragmatism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Today, we are embarking on a deep dive into the life and mind of a figure whose very name has become a byword for cunning, ruthlessness, and an unflinching, almost brutal political pragmatism.
Niccolò Machiavelli.
Ah, Machiavelli. The name itself carries so much weight.
It really does. The word Machiavellian itself often conjures these images of deception, manipulation, and an amorality that kind of chills us to the bone.
Right, it's almost always used negatively. But as we peel back the layers in this exploration, drawing directly from the wealth of sources you've provided, we'll uncover, I think, a much deeper, far more complex reality behind that popular caricature.
Indeed. And our mission with this deep dive is precisely that. To move beyond that often negative, sort of one-dimensional perception, we really aim to genuinely understand the intricate historical context,
Yeah.
the lived experiences that shaped his worldview, and the truly groundbreaking ideas of the real Florentine diplomat.
Because he was a real person, a
Yeah,
diplomat.
absolutely. And his insights, forged in an era of unprecedented turmoil and political upheaval, they still echo with remarkable clarity in the halls of power today. They fundamentally influence how we perceive governance, how we analyze leadership, and even how we understand the very nature of the modern state.
So he wasn't just a product of his time, he transcended it.
In many ways, yes. He was deeply embedded in his time, but his analysis had legs, you could say.
Okay, let's unpack this then, because Machiavelli isn't just some abstract philosopher, toiling away in an ivory tower.
Not at all.
He was a man of action, a diplomat, who emerged from and was deeply shaped by a truly fascinating, incredibly volatile moment in history. A period, in fact, that fundamentally informed and arguably necessitated every single one of his, let's face it, radical ideas about power.
You really can't understand the ideas without understanding the world he lived in.
Exactly. To grasp Machiavelli, we first have to understand that world. So imagine stepping back in time, late 15th, early 16th century Europe. This wasn't a calm, settled landscape, quite the opposite.
Far from it.
It was a continent in the throes of profound transformation across every conceivable dimension. Politically, religiously, economically, intellectually, it was chaotic.
Think about the tectonic plates of power shifting, as you said. The old, rigid, feudal structures of the Middle Ages, those hierarchical systems of lords and vassals, land and loyalty, they were dissolving.
They were crumbling, weren't they? Under the weight of changing economic realities, the rise of powerful merchant classes, the burgeoning growth of towns and cities.
Exactly. And in their place, we began to witness the undeniable rise of centralized monarchies. You had powerful kings in France, Spain, England, really consolidating their control, expanding their territories, establishing professional armies, bureaucracies.
A huge change from the decentralized medieval setup.
A stark contrast, and simultaneously, and this is just as crucial, the absolute authority of the Catholic Church, which had for centuries dominated not just spiritual life, but also intellectual thought and political governance.
Wow.
Well, it was increasingly being questioned.
This wasn't just theological debates in universities.
No, no, it had massive intellectual and political repercussions. We were shifting away from a purely church-centric scholastic framework where knowledge and political theory were largely interpreted through theological lenses, aimed at spiritual salvation towards more secular, more human-centered understandings.
The focus really began to pivot.
It did. From the divine to the human, from abstract dogma to observable, worldly reality, what actually works here on Earth.
That's such a critical shift. And nowhere was this transformation more acutely felt or more dramatically played out than in Italy itself.
Italy.
This wasn't the unified nation-state we recognize today with its clear borders and central government. Not even close.
No, Italy at the time was this fragmented, kaleidoscopic political landscape. A volatile collection of warring city-states, powerful principalities, each basically a miniature sovereign entity, constantly vying for dominance.
And each with its own complex internal dynamics, factions, ambitions.
Absolutely. You had the major players, Florence, of course, Machiavelli's beloved home, a republic, but often teetering on the brink of political upheaval.
Always seems to be teetering.
Then there was the formidable maritime Republic of Venice, a commercial powerhouse.
Yeah.
The Duchy of Milan, ruled by powerful families like the Sforza. The Kingdom of Naples down south, a prize often contested by foreign powers. And, of course, the Papal States,
Right in the middle of it all.
wielding immense spiritual authority alongside very tangible temporal power, right there in the heart of the peninsula.
And these weren't friendly neighbors playing nice.
Not in the slightest. They were locked in a state of perpetual, often violent competition. And this constant rivalry wasn't some abstract theoretical exercise. It led to an almost unending cycle of civil wars within cities, swift and brutal coups, betrayals, political assassinations,
Nasty stuff.
and significantly devastating external interventions. We're talking major European powers like France and Spain, seeing Italy's fragmentation as basically an open invitation.
Come on in, the water's fine for conquering.
Pretty much. Invade, plunder, carve out their own spheres of influence. Think about the French King Charles VIII's invasion in 1494, then Louis XII, then the Spanish. They dramatically reshaped the peninsula's political map and served as a harsh lesson in the brutal realities of power projection.
So just imagine growing up, living, working in that kind of environment. It's intense.
Intense is an understatement. It's not a place conducive to idealistic musings on universal virtue or the perfectibility of man, is it?
No way. It's a crucible that demands practical, often harsh political realities. This constant state of flux, this existential battle for survival, it directly informed Machiavelli's pragmatic, results-oriented approach to politics.
He wasn't just observing theory. He was living the raw, unvarnished realities of power, day in, day out.
And fascinatingly, this chaotic backdrop also coexisted with this period of incredible intellectual flowering.
That's what's truly fascinating here, the contrast. Machiavelli was simultaneously steeped in this broader Renaissance movement. This was the era of a profound humanist revival, a passionate drive to return to classical antiquity.
Going back to the sources, right?
Exactly. Scholars were actively rediscovering, transcribing, rereading ancient Greek and Roman texts, thinkers like Livy, Cicero, Tacitus, Polybius in their original Latin and Greek.
And this wasn't just academics and libraries.
No, it led to a fundamental rethinking of human potential, societal organization, the very purpose of life, moving away from purely theological interpretations. The focus shifted to human achievements, human history, human agency in shaping the world.
So, as a direct result, fields like politics, history, ethics, philosophy, they were increasingly being secularized.
Yes, explicitly moving beyond a purely theological or moralistic framework. The central question started shifting from what God wills or what is virtuous according to Christian doctrine to what works for humanity, or more pointedly, what effectively serves the state and its preservation.
A whole new way of looking at governance.
And so it was an intellectual explosion that challenged established norms. And Machiavelli wasn't just a beneficiary of this intellectual ferment. He was a figure who pushed its boundaries further than almost anyone else.
How so?
He took this humanist drive to look at the world as it is, not as it necessarily should be, and applied it relentlessly, unflinchingly to the art of governance. He asked the hard questions that others preferred to avoid.
Okay, so with that chaotic yet intellectually vibrant backdrop firmly in mind, let's turn our attention to the man himself, Niccolò Machiavelli, born May 3, 1469, right in the heart of the Florentine Republic.
Florence.
Now, his family, while not part of the super elite nobility that ruled Florence, they were certainly respectable and, crucially, intellectually rich. His father, Bernardo Machiavelli, was a legal consultant and a Latin scholar.
Which was key.
So from a very early age, Niccolò had access to, well, a modest library, but one filled with classical texts. And he got a solid foundation in Latin. That would prove absolutely crucial later on, wouldn't it?
Absolutely crucial. That command of Latin in particular formed the bedrock of his intellectual connection with the great Roman historians and thinkers, Livy chief among them. His History of Rome would become the direct inspiration for one of Machiavelli's most significant works, the Discourses on Livy.
He wasn't just reading summaries, he was going straight to the source.
Exactly. Engaging directly with the original texts, absorbing the political wisdom, the military strategies, the historical cycles that so profoundly influenced his later theories. And interestingly, much of his early education, the sources suggest, was self-directed.
Really? So he wasn't just following a set curriculum?
Apparently not entirely. This indicates a truly inquisitive, independent mind, someone who sought knowledge actively rather than passively receiving it. Which kind of explains his later radical approach to political thought. He wasn't necessarily bound by conventional academic strictures.
That makes sense. And this self-directed learner, this astute observer of the Florentine political scene, in 1498, at the relatively young age of 29, he ascended to a surprisingly significant position within the Florentine Republic.
Second chancellor.
Second chancellor, yeah.
Mhm.
And that sounds maybe bureaucratic, but it wasn't a minor desk job.
Yeah.
No, this was a hugely multifaceted political role. It encompassed both internal administration, managing the daily affairs, the committees, the endless paperwork of Florence, and crucially, foreign relations. He was, in essence, a high-ranking civil servant and a diplomat rolled into one,
Wow. So he was right in the thick of it.
deep in it. And it was these years, from 1498 to 1512, particularly his extensive diplomatic missions, that became the true crucible for his political thought. He traveled extensively on behalf of Florence.
Where did he go? Who did he meet? All over. He gained firsthand experience in the intricate, often treacherous world of Renaissance diplomacy. He had direct contact with immensely powerful and often ruthless figures. He met King Louis XII of France multiple times, observing his expansionist ambitions and his often failed Italian policies.
Okay.
He interacted with King Ferdinand of Spain, a master of cunning and strategic deception. He engaged with the various popes and their courts, witnessing the papacy's blend of spiritual and temporal power. And perhaps most notably, he spent significant time observing and interacting with Caesar Borgia.
Ah, Borgia. Here's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Because these firsthand observations, these real-world interactions with some of the most formidable pragmatic leaders of his era, they directly shaped his political thought in a way no amount of armchair philosophy ever could have.
Absolutely. He saw power in action, raw, unvarnished, and often brutally effective.
So tell us more about Caesar Borgia. Why did Machiavelli admire him so much, given Borgia's, let's be honest, infamous reputation?
Right, Borgia is not exactly remembered as a saint. But for Machiavelli, Cesare Borgia wasn't just another powerful individual. He was, in many ways, a living embodiment of the concept of virtue.
Okay, virtue. Let's define that carefully. It's not virtue like piety or being nice.
Not at all. Let's be really clear here. This is not virtue in the traditional classical or Christian moral sense of ethical uprightness. For Machiavelli, virtue was this complex, dynamic set of qualities. It encompassed decisiveness, courage, strategic brilliance, foresight, the ability to act swiftly and effectively, to seize opportunities, and crucially, to remain composed and adaptable in moments of crisis.
So competence, maybe. Skill, strength, audacity.
Yes, almost an amoral competence, you could say. Borgia, who was the son of Pope Alexander VI, despite his often brutal and deceptive methods, displayed this kind of decisiveness and strategic foresight in his audacious attempt to consolidate power and establish a unified state in the Romagna region of Italy.
So, in Machiavelli's eyes, Borgia's actions, even if they involved, profound severity, calculated deception, outright ruthlessness, they weren't necessarily moral failings.
Not from a purely political perspective, no. Machiavelli saw them as concrete manifestations of what worked in the chaotic, cutthroat reality of Renaissance politics. He saw Borgia as someone who could potentially master fortune, fortuna.
So Borgia's severity, his unwavering decisiveness, like executing his rebellious captains at Senigallia, that infamous incident.
Exactly. Those weren't seen primarily as moral transgressions by Machiavelli. Instead, they were practical necessities, lessons in political effectiveness. These observations fueled Machiavelli's core propositions about the true nature of politics, that results matter more than intentions.
Right.
That a leader must be willing to employ all necessary tools, however unpalatable, to achieve and maintain stability for the state. He viewed Borgia as a pragmatic actor who understood the unvarnished realities of power, unlike many of his contemporaries who clung to idealistic notions that ultimately led to their downfall.
So he admired the political mastery, not necessarily the personal ethics.
Precisely. It's a crucial distinction.
It's truly fascinating how a single figure could so profoundly influence his entire worldview, shifting him from maybe theoretical ideals towards this hard-nosed practical necessity. But then came the turning point in Machiavelli's own life, a dramatic reversal of fortune that would paradoxically lead to the creation of his most important works.
Yeah, the wheel of fortune turns. In 1512, the Medici family, who had been exiled from Florence for years, returned to power.
Backed by Spanish arms, right?
Largely supported by Spanish military might, yes.
Right.
And this spelled the definitive end of the Republican government. Machiavelli had served so diligently for 14 years.
Everything changed for him.
That's right. The Republican government collapsed under the weight of foreign intervention, and with it, Machiavelli's world turned completely upside down. He was summarily dismissed from his post, then accused of conspiracy,
Oh, wow.
imprisoned, and even subjected to torture on the rack.
Torture. That's brutal.
It was a harsh and incredibly personal blow. A traumatic experience for a man who had dedicated years of his life to public service and the welfare of Florence. However, he was eventually released, pardoned as part of a general amnesty, and then exiled to a small family farm in Sanandroia in Percasina, just outside Florence.
Forced retirement, basically.
Exactly. And it's this period of forced solitude, away from the political fray he so loved and where he had been so active, that paradoxically marked the true beginning of his prolific writing career. The sources clearly indicate that this profound personal setback channeled his energies into intellectual production.
It's almost like a phoenix rising from the ashes of his political career. From this period of forced reflection and, let's face it, bitter disappointment, we get his most enduring and influential major works. The Prince, Discourses on Livy, and Art of War.
The Big Three.
And these weren't just academic exercises, were they? They were direct, visceral responses to the chaos he lived through, the lessons he learned, and in some ways his attempt to understand why Florence, and maybe he himself, had failed.
Definitely. And what's also clear is that despite this incredible intellectual outpouring, he still yearned desperately for a return to public life. He was constantly attempting to regain influence, trying to secure a new position with the Medicis.
Did he ever succeed?
Not really. He ultimately failed to secure a significant, lasting return to power, remaining largely on the periphery until his death in 1527. His personal political career, which had started so promisingly, effectively ended in disappointment and marginalization.
But it was precisely this personal adversity that forged his intellectual legacy.
It seems so. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound insights are not born in comfort, but in the crucible of personal adversity, political upheaval, and the painful process of reflecting on failure. He used his forced leisure to analyze the past in order to understand the present and perhaps influence the future.
Okay, now we arrive at the very core of our deep dive, Machiavelli's truly radical philosophy. The ideas that continue to provoke, inspire, and, well, disturb to this day. His most groundbreaking idea, the one that really sets him apart from virtually all his predecessors, is this concept of the autonomy of politics.
Yes, this is huge.
He essentially separated politics from morality and ethics, as they were traditionally understood, a concept that was truly revolutionary for his time.
Absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is precisely where Machiavelli fundamentally breaks from thousands of years of Western political philosophy. Thinkers from ancient Greece, like Plato and Aristotle, for example, they saw politics as inextricably linked to ethics.
Right. The polis was meant to cultivate virtue.
Exactly. For Aristotle, the purpose of the state was to cultivate virtue in its citizens, to create conditions for a good life where moral character could flourish. Medieval Christian thinkers like St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas also viewed earthly governance through a moral and divine lens. A ruler's legitimacy and actions were ultimately judged by divine law and moral rectitude.
But Machiavelli says, no.
Essentially, yeah. For Machiavelli, politics was not about achieving a moral ideal or conforming to ethical precepts. Instead, he saw it as an activity with its own internal laws, its own logic, its own necessary tools, completely independent of the prevailing moral or religious norms of the time.
It's a power game.
It's a power game, yes, but one based on stark, observed reality, not on abstract ideals, what actually happens in the world of power.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, for Machiavelli, the primary goal of a ruler isn't to be morally upright in the traditional sense, to be good or just in an absolute way.
Not primarily, no.
Instead, their paramount responsibility is to ensure the order, stability, and survival of the state, and to maintain their own power as the instrument of that stability.
That's the core of it.
And he argues that if achieving these paramount ends requires deception, breaking promises, lying, or even instilling fear in the populace, these aren't violations of political nature.
He'd say they are its necessary and at times unavoidable tools. It's about efficacy and results over idealism or traditional moral purity.
Wow, that's stark.
It is stark. But he wasn't advocating for evil's sake, or for arbitrary tyranny. That's a crucial distinction often missed.
Okay, explain that.
What he was stating, based on his empirical observations, was that in the brutal pursuit of state stability and survival, a leader must be prepared to do what is necessary, even if those actions appear morally questionable or outright condemnable from a private ethical standpoint.
So he forces us to ask what truly works.
Exactly, what truly works to maintain power and preserve the state in a dangerous world, rather than what should work if everyone were perfectly virtuous. He was saying, look at what actually happens, not what ought to happen according to philosophical or religious doctrines. This unflinching realism was truly shocking to his contemporaries.
And I imagine it's still shocking to many today. This radical pragmatism leads us directly into his central concepts of virtue and fortuna. These are absolutely key, aren't they?
Absolutely essential to understanding his vision of a successful ruler.
You already touched on virtue a bit when discussing Caesar Borgia, but let's dive deeper. It's clearly much more than just classical virtue.
Oh, much more. Virtue for Machiavelli is a much more dynamic, complex, and decidedly a moral concept. It's the capacity of a leader to be effective, to make things happen, to control events rather than be controlled by them.
So agency.
Agency, yes, but combined with skill and force. It encompasses a unique blend of qualities: decisiveness, courage, strategic brilliance, foresight, adaptability, and the willingness to do whatever is necessary to achieve one's political aims. It's about being able to seize opportunities and overcome obstacles with force of will and intelligence.
Like a blend of skill, strength, and audacity, as you said before.
Exactly. The examples Machiavelli drew from beyond Borgia were often from ancient Roman figures like Romulus, who founded Rome through decisive, even fratricidal action, or Roman generals who secured victories through cunning and ruthlessness. Virtue is active, it's proactive, it's a sort of masculine, energetic force that shapes events.
Okay, so virtue is the ruler's inherent capability, their internal strength, skill, sheer force of will. But then there's fortuna. What exactly does Machiavelli mean by fortuna, and how does it interact with virtue?
Right, fortuna. This represents chance, fate, or fortune, the external, uncontrollable forces that constantly buffet human affairs and often defy human planning.
Luck, or more than luck.
It's more than just luck. It's the unpredictable nature of events, the elements that are beyond a ruler's direct control. It could be an unexpected invasion, a natural disaster, a sudden shift in alliances, a turn in public sentiment, or even simply bad luck. Machiavelli profoundly understood that even the most virtuous ruler, possessed of immense skill and foresight, could still be undone by the unpredictable whims of fortuna.
So you can have all the skill in the world, but things can still go wrong.
Exactly. He saw fortuna as almost a female deity, capricious, who must be boldly confronted and, at times, even maybe battered to be mastered.
So the successful ruler, then, is engaged in this constant precarious dance between their own virtue and the unpredictable nature of fortuna. How do they master destiny if so much is truly beyond their control?
Well, master might be too strong a word sometimes. The key to success, for Machiavelli, lies in a ruler's virtue to navigate and, crucially, to turn the opportunities or challenges presented by fortuna to their advantage. To adapt.
Adaptability is key.
Hugely key. He famously uses that vivid allegory from The Prince to explain this. He says fortuna is like an uncontrolled, raging river capable of devastating floods that lay waste to the land.
Right. I remember that one.
But while you cannot stop the river from flowing or prevent all floods, you can build strong embankments, dikes, and channels during calm times. That's where virtue comes in.
Ah, so the embankments are the virtue.
The embankments are the ruler's preparedness, their foresight, their strategic actions, their military strength, their alliances, their cunning, all designed to channel or mitigate the destructive force of fortuna when it inevitably rises.
So it's not about passively accepting fate, but actively striving to shape it, or at least manage its impact, through skill and will. That's a powerful image.
It truly is. And this imagery of managing the natural world, directing its forces rather than being overwhelmed by them, it connects his thought directly to natural philosophy and particularly to Roman historiography, where the cyclical nature of events and the role of great men in shaping them were central themes.
So a ruler's success hinges on this ability to adapt, to be flexible.
Yes, to recognize when to be impetuous and when to be cautious, all in response to Fortuna's changing currents. Sometimes, he says, Fortuna is best conquered by audacity, almost as if she prefers the bold. At other times, patience is required. The truly virtuous ruler understands this dynamic, adapting their methods to the circumstances, always with the state's security as the ultimate goal.
which is why he admired Borgia, perhaps, who for a time at least seemed to successfully master his fortuna through sheer force of virtue.
Exactly. Borgia's rise was meteoric, seemingly against the odds, fueled by virtue. Though, of course, fortuna eventually turned against him too.
Right. This brings us to Machiavelli's view of the people and sovereignty. He's often cited for his rather pessimistic, maybe even cynical, view of human nature. Tell us more about that.
Indeed, Machiavelli paints a quite unflattering picture of general human nature, a perspective rooted again in his extensive observation of political life. He believes people are inherently self-interested, ungrateful, fickle, cowardly in the face of danger, and driven primarily by their own gain and security.
Doesn't hold back, does he?
No. He famously states that men are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous. This perspective leads him to focus very pragmatically on power relationships and his understanding of politics, rather than idealistic notions of individual virtue.
Because if you assume the worst,
If you understand that people will likely act out of self-interest, you can better predict, and therefore better control and manage their behavior to serve the state. A ruler, he suggests, must assume the worst of human nature and act accordingly. It's safer that way.
so if people are so inherently flawed, so self-serving and unreliable, why give them any role at all in the political process? This raises an important question, doesn't it? Especially given what we know about his Republican leanings, which seem much more evident in his discourses. Is he just suggesting that people are pawns?
That's precisely where the nuance comes in, and where his discourses on Livy become so vital for a complete understanding of Machiavelli. It's not quite that simple.
Okay, tell me more.
Despite his pessimistic view of individual human nature, Machiavelli does not entirely exclude the people from the political process. In discourses, he argues quite forcefully that the people, as a collective, when properly organized through institutions, serve as a crucial check on the ambitions of the nobility and even the ruler.
So the crowd isn't just a mob.
Not necessarily. He believed that the dynamic tension or even open conflict between the great, the nobles who desire to dominate, and the people, the common citizens who desire not to be oppressed, was actually a source of strength and vitality for a republic.
Conflict is a good thing.
Managed conflict, yes. This continuous managed conflict, often channeled through legal frameworks and institutions, leads to greater liberty and stability in the long run, in his view. He looked at Rome, where the struggles between the Senate and the plebeians led to laws that ultimately strengthened the republic.
That's a really important distinction then, separating his views in the Prince, which is maybe focused on a specific crisis situation, from his broader, more Republican ideas in discourses.
Exactly. It's not just about one strong man. It's about the very structure of the state itself and how different forces within it can balance each other out.
Which leads us nicely to his ultimate concern, state continuity and the principle of necessity, or raison d'etat, reason of state.
Yes. For Machiavelli, the continuity, survival, and well-being of the state is the absolute first priority. It trumps all other values, including traditional morality or individual desires. The state is the supreme good, the entity whose preservation justifies actions that might otherwise be deemed immoral.
The ends justify the means for the state.
That's often how it's interpreted, yes. This intense focus on the state's supreme importance and its own internal logic forms the earliest articulation of what later came to be known as reason of state, or raison d'etat, the idea that the state's interests dictate its actions regardless of conventional morality.
And that concept has had a huge influence, hasn't it?
Immense influence on political thought and international relations for centuries, shaping how nations interact and make decisions.
So a ruler must base decisions fundamentally on necessity, on what is absolutely required for the state to endure, rather than on traditional ethical norms.
Yeah.
It's a very cold, hard assessment, almost clinical.
Precisely. It can indeed justify harsh decisions, even actions that appear cruel or deceitful from a moral standpoint. Machiavelli gives examples. A prince might need to break promises if keeping them is detrimental to the state, or maybe appear merciful and religious even if he isn't privately.
But in this scene's crucial, he isn't advocating for just random cruelty.
No, absolutely not. And this is crucial. Machiavelli isn't advocating for arbitrary cruelty or impulsive violence. He advocates for a cold, calculated, and extremely judicious application of these means. If a ruler must be cruel, it should be done decisively, swiftly, and for a clear purpose related to the state's security, not out of personal malice or revenge.
Get it done quickly and effectively.
Like, cruelty must be effective, used minimally and ideally, quickly forgotten, perhaps balanced with benefits to the people later. He's pragmatic, not sadistic. It's all about what is necessary for the state to endure, to thrive, and to maintain order, not for the ruler's personal satisfaction, but for the collective good, the stability of the state itself.
Okay, now let's turn our attention to his masterpieces, the actual works he penned during that forced exile, those years of intense reflection. First up, the one everyone knows, the one that gave us the very word Machiavellian, Il Principe or The Prince.
The big one. This is, without a doubt, his most famous and certainly most debated work, written around 1513, though only published posthumously in 1532.
So he didn't even see it published.
No, and The Prince is this concise, intense political handbook, a brutal primer, really, for acquiring and maintaining power. It's dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici.
Trying to get back in their good graces.
That was clearly part of the motivation, yes. An attempt by Machiavelli to regain favor and demonstrate his utility to the ruling family. The book advises a new ruler, particularly a prince who has recently acquired power in a fragmented and volatile environment like Renaissance Italy, on how to establish and maintain that power successfully. Its content is stark, unromanticized, and often shocking in its frankness.
So it's definitely not a guide on how to be a good or moral prince in the traditional sense, is it? It feels almost like the opposite.
Not at all. That's the crucial insight that often gets misunderstood and leads to that popular caricature of Machiavelli. The prince does not prescribe how an ideal prince should behave according to Christian or classical virtues.
It describes what they actually do or must do.
Exactly. It meticulously describes what a leader must be prepared to do, the often unpleasant, ethically dubious, but practically effective actions to hold power in a dangerous world. Machiavelli examines real historical and contemporary examples like Caesar Borgia, even figures from antiquity, to illustrate how power is truly acquired and maintained, often through means that conventional morality would vehemently condemn.
He's saying, look, this is how the game is played.
Essentially, yes, this is what works in the real world of politics, whether you like it or not. If you wish to survive and thrive as a ruler, you must understand these truths. It's a stark, almost surgical look at the realities of power, stripped bare of any illusions or moralizing. He famously argued that a prince must learn how not to be good if necessity requires it.
A pragmatic, maybe even cynical manual. But then we have Discorsi sopra la prima decada di Tito Livio, or Discourses on Livy. This seems to showcase a dramatically different, almost contradictory side of Machiavelli, revealing his Republican leanings. How do these two works reconcile? They seem so different.
That's the central question for many Machiavellian scholars. And you're right, understanding the discourses is essential for a complete and nuanced understanding of his thought. They do seem different on the surface.
So how do they fit together?
Well, while The Prince focuses on individual leadership, particularly for a new principality in a specific unstable context, like how to establish power from scratch or after chaos, Discourses delves into institutional and popular forms of governance. It draws extensively on his deep historical consciousness and his clear admiration for the Roman Republic.
So it's broader in scope.
Much broader. It's a commentary on the first 10 books of Livy's History of Rome, analyzing how political virtue, maybe civic virtue here, can be institutionalized within a republic, how liberty and order can be maintained over centuries. He looks at how the inherent conflicts within a society, particularly between the people and the nobility, can actually be a source of strength if managed through legal channels.
So conflict again, but managed conflict.
Exactly. He saw the Roman Republic's longevity and strength as a testament to its ability to channel internal discord into productive political outcomes and good laws. It reveals his complex understanding of how political systems, not just individuals, sustain power and liberty over time. So it's not necessarily a contradiction with the prince, but rather two sides of the same coin.
How so?
The prince deals with founding or reforming a state, often in crisis, how to get power and stabilize things quickly. Discourses is more about how to maintain a stable, free state over generations once it's established. One is about the emergency, the other about the long haul.
That distinction clarifies so much. Okay, and finally, his third major work, Dell'arte di guerra, or Art of War. What's the core message there, and why was warfare so central to his vision of statecraft?
In Art of War, which is interestingly presented as a dialogue, Machiavelli argues that warfare is not just an occasional necessity, but a fundamental, unavoidable duty of a ruler and an intrinsic part of governing and maintaining the state. He believed that a prince, or the leaders of a republic, must be utterly dedicated to the art of war, even in times of peace.
Why so central?
He saw it as the ultimate means of state preservation. You couldn't rely on others. And he strongly critiques the prevailing reliance on mercenary armies, which were incredibly common in Italy at the time.
He didn't trust mercenaries.
Not one bit. He viewed them as weak, unreliable, disloyal, and ultimately a direct threat to the state's security because their loyalty was purely to pay, not to the republic or its ruler. He had first-hand experience witnessing their failures and betrayals during his diplomatic missions for Florence. He saw them change sides, run away, fail to fight effectively.
So what was the alternative he advocated for?
He strongly advocated for the establishment of organized citizen militias. His proposal was for armies composed of the state's own citizens, combining military discipline with civic virtue.
People fighting for their own homes.
Exactly. He believed that such a force would be more loyal, more motivated, and ultimately more effective than hired foreign soldiers, as they would be fighting for their own homes, their own liberty, their own state. This idea, again, drew heavy inspiration from the military organization of ancient Rome, where the citizen soldier was paramount.
Did he ever try to implement this?
He did, actually. He even tried to implement this practically in Florence during his time in government, helping to organize a Florentine militia, though ultimately it proved insufficient against the overwhelming Spanish forces that brought down the Republic in 1512. But the idea was there. This work really highlights his holistic view of statecraft, where military power and a well-trained, engaged citizenry are inseparable from political stability and liberty.
It's clear that Machiavelli's ideas were profoundly radical for his time, almost shocking. So how were they received initially? Was he hailed as a visionary genius right away?
Oh, not at all, far from it. In fact, his ideas were not immediately embraced, quite the opposite. When The Prince was published posthumously in 1532, its frank, unadorned analysis of power politics caused widespread scandal and outrage, especially in religious circles.
They weren't happy.
Not happy is putting it mildly. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the term Machiavellianism quickly became a pejorative strongly associated with demonic, deceptive, and amoral politics. He was seen as someone who taught rulers how to be tyrants, how to manipulate, betray, lie.
The devil's handbook, basically.
And how many saw it? Critics, particularly from religious establishments, condemned him as an agent of the devil, and his works were placed on the Catholic Church's index of forbidden books. This overwhelmingly negative perception largely overshadowed the nuances of his thought for centuries. He was portrayed as an advocate for evil rather than a sober empirical analyst of political reality. He was, quite literally, vilified.
So he was pretty much reviled for a long time, the ultimate political bogeyman. When did that start to change? When did thinkers begin to reevaluate him more objectively?
It really wasn't until the Enlightenment period, roughly the 18th century, that thinkers began to assess Machiavelli more objectively and, crucially, within his proper historical context.
What changed?
The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, empirical observation, and a more, let's say, scientific approach to society allowed for a more critical, but also more appreciative engagement with his work. Philosophers started to see him not necessarily as a promoter of evil, but perhaps as a realist who accurately described the mechanisms of power stripped of moralizing pretense.
Separating the is from the ought.
Exactly. They began to separate his analysis of what is from a prescription of what ought to be. This allowed for a more nuanced, though still often contentious, reevaluation of his contribution to political thought. People started reading him more carefully.
And he certainly influenced a lot of big names in political philosophy after that, shaping their own theories. Who are some of the key thinkers who drew from him? And what were their interpretations? Because they weren't all the same, were they?
No, definitely not. A significant figure who clearly drew from him, though perhaps implicitly, is Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher of the 17th century.
Hobbes and Leviathan.
Right. Hobbes, in Leviathan, clearly developed Machiavelli's pessimistic views on human nature. Like Machiavelli, Hobbes believed humanity was inherently self-interested, driven by a perpetual war of all against all in a state of nature.
Sounds pretty bleak.
It is. And from this, Hobbes concluded that only a strong, absolute sovereign, a Leviathan, could prevent chaos and ensure order. This echoes Machiavelli's emphasis on the necessity of a powerful ruler to maintain state stability, although Hobbes takes it to a more absolute conclusion. Hobbes's famous view that covenants without the sword are but words directly reflects Machiavelli's insistence on the need for effective power.
Okay, so Hobbes picks up on the pessimism and the need for strong power. Who else?
Then, intriguingly, you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the 18th century Genevan philosopher. He provided a truly radical reinterpretation in his Social Contract.
Rousseau. He seems so different from Machiavelli.
He does, but Rousseau famously argued that The Prince was not, in fact, a guide for tyrants at all. He believed it was actually written by Machiavelli as a kind of warning.
A warning. To who?
To the common people. Rousseau argued it was designed to educate them about the true nature of tyranny and expose the manipulative tactics rulers employ. He believed Machiavelli was subtly telling the people, look, this is how princes rule. This is what you must guard against.
Wow, that completely flips the Machiavellian label on its head, suggesting he was a secret advocate for Republican liberty all along.
Exactly. It's a fascinating reinterpretation, one that continues to be debated by scholars today. It transforms the perceived intent of the work entirely.
That's incredible. Who else?
Well, there's Montesquieu, another central figure in the Enlightenment, particularly known for his ideas on the separation of powers and republicanism. He drew significant inspiration for his understanding of institutionalized liberty directly from Machiavelli's discourses.
From the discourses, not the prince.
Primarily, yes. Montesquieu's analysis of the Roman Republic, in his considerations on the causes of the greatness of the Romans and their decline, heavily echoes Machiavelli's insights into the dynamic tension between social classes and how this conflict, when properly channeled by laws and institutions, contributes to a state's strength and longevity. He saw Machiavelli as a profound student of republicanism, offering practical lessons on maintaining freedom through institutional design.
So Montesquieu saw the Republican Machiavelli.
Yes. And then jumping forward quite a bit into the 20th century, we see Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist thinker, offering yet another influential interpretation from his prison notebooks.
Gramsci, how did a Marxist interpret Machiavelli?
Gramsci interpreted Machiavelli not merely as a theorist of the prince or even just of the state, but as a theorist for the Revolutionary Party itself. Gramsci saw Machiavelli's insights on how to acquire and maintain power, how to create consent and legitimacy among the populace, not just through force, but through intellectual and moral leadership.
Ah, the idea of hegemony.
Exactly. Gramsci saw Machiavelli's work as laying the groundwork for the modern concept of hegemony. For Gramsci, Machiavelli provided a kind of blueprint for how a new revolutionary power could establish subtle dominance, not just through coercive means, but by influencing the ideas and values of a society, leading to a kind of cultural and intellectual leadership.
So his influence stretched far beyond just individual leadership or even the state itself. He's also considered a foundational figure for an entire school of thought in international relations, isn't he? The realists.
Absolutely. Machiavelli is widely identified as a foundational figure for the realist school in international relations theory. This school, which remains incredibly influential today, views international politics as fundamentally a struggle for power among self-interested states in an anarchic system, meaning there's no world government.
So states have to look out for themselves.
Primarily, yes.
Yeah.
Realism focuses on national interest, military capabilities, and reason of state as the primary drivers of interaction between nations. It often downplays the role of morality, international law, or international institutions, seeing them as secondary to power politics.
And Machiavelli laid the groundwork for that.
His insights into how states actually behave in a dangerous world, rather than how they should ideally behave, really laid the groundwork for this perspective. He emphasized that in the absence of a higher authority, states must prioritize their own survival and power above all else.
Which means, for all his historical distance, his ideas are still incredibly potent and relevant today. So as we wrap up our deep dive here, what does this all mean for us today in our modern world?
Well, I think Machiavelli's insights remain a crucial reference point. You see echoes in contemporary state management, in how political communication works, and leadership studies, and particularly in crisis management.
Crisis management, that makes sense.
Think about it. When leaders face impossible choices in a crisis, whether it's a pandemic, an economic collapse, a national security threat when national interest becomes paramount, or when a state's very existence feels threatened, that tension between ethics and necessity, which is so central to Machiavelli's thought, becomes acutely relevant again.
The hard choices.
The hard choices. His works provide a framework for analyzing why leaders make the decisions they do, even when those decisions appear harsh, morally ambiguous, or deeply unpopular. He forces us to look beyond the veneer of idealism to the underlying mechanics of power, to consider the real politic that often drives decisions in a world that is, let's face it, far from perfect.
His enduring legacy is that unflinching honesty about political life.
I think so. That refusal to look away from the difficult aspects of power.
So, to recap then, Niccolò Machiavelli achieved something truly monumental, something that profoundly shaped the modern world. He He secularized politics, didn't he? Stripping it away from theological and abstract moral dogmas, understanding it on its own terms as a distinct field of human activity.
That's a great way to put it.
For him, politics was fundamentally an arena of action, where results were the decisive measure. The success of an action was judged not by the legitimacy of its aim in a moral sense, but by the effectiveness of its outcome in securing the state's interests.
Exactly. And this approach, so revolutionary for its time, laid the cornerstone for the modern state and for the concept of political reason. But, and this is important to reiterate,
Yes.
what's fascinating here is that he wasn't just advocating for power's sake, or for arbitrary tyranny. While the prince focuses intensely on acquiring and maintaining power, his discourses reveal his deep commitment to the stability and continuity of the state, and even the freedom and liberty of its citizens within a well-ordered republic.
So there's that Republican side again.
Yes. He saw a strong, secure state as the ultimate guarantor of its people's well-being and liberty, and that a truly free republic required a citizenry willing and able to defend itself. His legacy is far from being merely a guide to power for tyrants. He was also a profound theorist of citizenship, republican liberty, and the preservation of robust political institutions. It's much more complex.
So understanding Machiavelli isn't just about exploring a historical genius or a controversial figure from centuries past. It's really about equipping ourselves with the mental tools to analyze the complexities of today's politics.
So.
To reconcile that ever-present tension between what should be and what, in the harsh glare of reality, maybe is necessary. It's about discerning how political authority truly operates throughout history and in our own time. It allows us to critically evaluate the actions of leaders and the dynamics of states with maybe a clearer eye.
Well said. And this raises perhaps an important final question for you, the listener, to ponder long after our deep dive concludes. In our own modern world, with all its complexities and ethical dilemmas, where do you see that Machiavellian tension, that pull between what should be and what is necessary playing out most acutely?
Good question.
What do you think is the most Machiavellian aspect of modern politics today, and how does recognizing it impact your understanding of the world around you? Something to think about.